6 minutes.
Gurmagat, Cahirlik, and I'd like to welcome you to the House, Minister, and on behalf of Labour, just to welcome this important bill, which we're glad to support, and to commend Senator McDowell and his colleagues for bringing it forward, and bringing it forward so swiftly after the judgment was delivered in the Court of Appeal on 29th October 2020. I think Senator McDowell had this bill in with us in the first week of November. So, and clearly others, including Deputy O'Callaghan, had also brought forward legislation to deal with what others have rightly described as this unforeseen consequence. And I'm struck by Senator Siri Carney's point about the wording of Section 252 of the Children Act. Certainly, I think reading it before this line of case law, one might well have thought that subsection 2 would have governed against the sort of that interpretation. But in any case, that's to revisit perhaps a previous reading. And clearly we have the very clear words now of Judge Birmingham. We do need to move legislatively to address those words and to ensure that the terrible injustice that has resulted for bereaved parents isn't allowed to continue. And Minister, you've spoken very eloquently about that, and I think all of us have been deeply moved by those who've come forward through the media to describe just the pain and trauma of being faced with this sort of consequence, where victims and families of victims' wishes are not respected, and where people are essentially left voiceless. And I wanted just to speak briefly about, I suppose, our views of victims in the criminal law more generally. I know we'll be able to parse the detailed provisions of this bill at committee stage, and I'm glad we'll be able to do that. But I do think we should see it as fitting within a general package of reforms to give victims more of a voice within our criminal justice system. And I'm really glad, Minister, that you announced on foot of the O'Malley report into the review of law on sexual offences that you're going to look at giving victims more of a voice, complainants more of a voice through sex offence trials. Many years ago, along with colleagues in Trinity, I did a report with the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre on the legal process and victims of rape, as a result of which we recommended separate legal representation for complainants in rape cases, where applications were made in the absence of the jury to bring forward, by the defence, to bring forward evidence of prior sexual history. It's a recommendation that's now established in our law through the 2001 Act, through a different 2001 Act, Sex Offenders Act, and it's something that I know in Northern Ireland, the Gillen report looked at very closely and made recommendations on foot of, and I think we'll see change there too. But that's, again, part of a number of ways in which I think we move to look at how we can encompass more of a voice for victims in our criminal justice system without encroaching unduly, of course, on rights of the defence. And this came home to me last night, again, looking at a programme about Jerry Ryan's life, but talking about how he, on his radio show, he had given a voice to Lavinia Kerwick, who so bravely came forward in early 90s, and whose voiced experience of being the anonymous complainant in a rape trial it gave rise to then the introduction in 1993 of the Victim Impact Statement. And again, that's made a huge difference in practice in our criminal courts, and has enabled victims to feel that they have more of a voice in the process. And of course, it took some time, however, for it to be recognised that the families of victims of homicide also needed that voice, and that the legislation hadn't adequately addressed that. And indeed, it was just a sort of practice that had built up among trial judges of allowing families of victims of homicide to speak about the impact the homicide had on them. So that change was made in 2010. So I suppose, we were learning, and this is part of that process of learning. I just want to speak briefly also on a number of other points arising from this private members' bill and the context in which it's brought forward. And others have spoken about the need for careful scrutiny of legislation, particularly criminal justice legislation, and that's absolutely true and clearly exemplified by the case law we've now seen on Section 252. But the 2001 Act itself was heavily scrutinised, but following and it was seen as a major reforming piece of law relating to children at the time, but it was, may I say, somewhat shambolic subsequently in the way in which it was commenced. And, I recall at the time as a practitioner representing children as young as 8 and 9 before the criminal courts, and we were all eagerly anticipating the change in the law of the age of criminal responsibility, which the 2001 Act was supposed to usher in. It didn't in the end. The provision lay dormant. It was finally amended in 2006 and only brought into law in July 2007. So So there were a lot of well-meaning reforms, but due to a lot of difficulty with their enactment, their commencement, it was brought in a somewhat piecemeal way, and I suppose again does raise the need for codification, for ensuring that we have a very clear body of criminal statute law and of law relating to children in particular. And if we don't have that, if we have piecemeal reform, the danger is that provisions aren't parsed properly, that unforeseen consequences occur, and that we see things like developments as we've seen with with Section 252 occurring. Could I just finish, Minister, by just thanking you for your engagement on a number of pieces of legislation, including this one with members in the opposition. Thank you for your engagement with Deputy Howlin on another important piece of law relating to children's rights and young adults, particularly Coco's law. And thank you for your engagement with me and my Labour colleagues here on the Born Here, Belong Here campaign and citizenship law for children born in Ireland to parents who are not Irish citizens. It's very important that we continue to engage, and I thank you for your willingness to do so constructively with those of us in opposition.
Next up is Senator